I will try to speak so that you can hear me. If you can't hear me and you would like to hear me, just let me know and I will try to do something differently so that you can hear. Touch. Touch. We have many different phrases with the word touch in our world. We have things like soft touch, touch up, touch and go. We have physical touch. And it seems like this time of year, our teams around here need more touchdowns in order to win their games. But in our world, scientists study touch, physical touch. And are you aware of some of the benefits of physical touch? So, for example, touching patients who suffer from Alzheimer's can have a significant effect on getting them to relax, to feel a closer emotional connection to others, and to reduce their symptoms of depression. And appropriate touch can also signal safety and trust and can activate that hormone oxytocin, that powerful hormone that's sometimes known as the cuddle or the love drug. And so in one study, babies born prematurely were given 3 touch therapy sessions a day for 15 minutes each. Then there was a control group infants who didn't receive any. So the results showed that the preemies who were touched for 15 minutes 3 times a day had gained 50% more weight than the control group. In other words, than those preemies who did not receive any touch. So notice that often it's the one who is touched is the one who receives something greater than the one who touches. Because as you can imagine, touch is nothing new. We see it in the scriptures all the time. Do you remember in the Old Testament? The Old Testament, when the great prophet Elijah, he was running for his life from Queen Jezebel, and he was so tired he just went to sleep under a tree. But the scriptures tell us an angel of the Lord touched Elijah, and then suddenly there was cake and water. And in the New Testament, remember in the book of Acts, what we read after Pascha each year, the apostles would go around because they were sent to preach the gospel. They were sent around and they would touch people with their hands. They would literally touch people with their hands, and those people whom they touched would receive the Holy Spirit. Touch. This morning we also heard about touch. Remember that Christ was walking and a woman who had been suffering for 12 long years, who was an outcast and had many difficulties, that Christ touched her. She touched Christ, actually, but she was touched by Christ. But do you remember what Christ said to her? He said, "Who touched me? For power went out of me." And in the end, the woman who was healed by Christ because she touched Christ. In other words, she was touched by Christ. And remember, in the latter part of the gospel reading this morning, there was a young child who was asleep or dead, as the scriptures tell us. And when Christ took her hand, in other words, Christ touched her hand, and immediately she was restored to life. So in other words, being touched by Christ was life-changing for the 2 individuals we heard about in the gospel this morning. But relating to us, because the gospel talks about touch today, we too also will talk about touch this morning. So if I asked you a question, and I will, who has touched your life? Who has touched your life most powerfully? Who would you say that is? I'll give you a little bit to think about it. Okay, so I hope you have an answer in your head. I have one answer in my ear of a grandfather already. So keep this person in your mind. So again, if you were asked, who has touched your life most powerfully, who would you say? Well, I wonder, in your answers to yourself, did anyone say God? Did anyone say God? Or did anyone even consider God for a second? Because if we didn't choose the Lord over another human person, in other words, if the Lord has not touched our life, if I can use that expression, more than anyone else, could it possibly be that we have not allowed the Lord to touch us? Maybe that's the reason. So what do I mean? I don't mean physically touched by the Lord, but rather, when I say touched by the Lord, that we've experienced this deep and faithful, loving commitment to the Lord. In other words, we know that God is real and active in our lives and in our world. Because for some of us as Orthodox Christians, it may be very easy to simply follow the customs and traditions of our faith, like making the sign of the cross, attending the divine liturgy, cracking the red eggs on Pascha, putting money in the tray. So please don't misunderstand. I'm not saying that these things are bad or not helpful in any way. I'm not saying that at all. Those can be very helpful things. But what I am saying or suggesting is maybe, just maybe, there's more that's required in order to know that the Lord is powerful and present in our own lives. So until we're touched by the Lord, sometimes our faith is not our own. I think especially for us as Orthodox. Because at some point in our lives, our faith has to become personal, deeply personal, in order to be touched by the Lord. It has to be more than the faith of our grandparents or our parents, or just simply following the customs and traditions of our faith, of which we have many. So then maybe you're thinking, well, how can the Lord become present? Well, sometimes, for some of us, in our most desperate moments, we cry out to the Lord to help us or to rescue us, and the Lord has made himself present. Sometimes it could be a near-death experience or an illness, and then we have called upon the name of the Lord and somehow converted our lives to know that God is active and present in our lives. Or it could have been something maybe like a personal crisis, a serious moral failure or mental illness, disaster, something when we called upon the name of the Lord. Maybe that's one way, I'm not sure. But again, how is it? How can the Lord become present in our lives? But I'm still wondering, how has the Lord touched your life? Because maybe you're like me and think, at times, maybe that my life hasn't been touched. Maybe you feel that your life has not been touched by the Lord. Well, if that's true, don't despair. Because that's where we need an experienced spiritual guide to listen to us and to direct us. And of course, in this community, this blessed community, you're so blessed to have Father Paul, who is a true spiritual guide. He is certainly someone who helps me. And so having him here every day, except for the next month or so, to have him as a spiritual guide. In other words, how can we live the spiritual life if we don't have someone to guide us and to help us? And when I think of spiritual guides, Father Paul is at the top of my list. Because it can be dangerous to do things our own way. And so especially if you feel like you've really been trying and the Lord is not close to you or you haven't been touched, maybe, just maybe, a time with Father Paul would be a great blessing. So until that time, and I'll have more to say in a minute about that, until Father Paul returns, there are things that all of us can do by God's grace. Some of these you know. In other words, things we can do to strengthen our faith, to know that the Lord is present and active in our lives. In other words, to make our faith our own. Of course, the simple one, but it's not so simple, is to pray. Because we read in the Psalms that the Lord is near to those who call upon him. And of course, as Orthodox Christians, we don't have to pray extemporaneously. In other words, to make up our own prayers. We have prayer books to help us with these things. And some very powerful ways to know that the Lord is present. And that is to unite ourselves to those who suffer. To unite ourselves to those who suffer. Because we can't take away their suffering in most cases. But uniting ourselves, in other words, being present, being next to them, can provide a comfort to them. Because we read in the Scriptures, the Lord is near to those who have a broken heart. The Lord is near to those who have a broken heart. And something else. By everything, you have everything in this community you need to allow the Lord to touch you, to be present in your lives. When I read the bulletin and I see the men's morning group, the women's morning group, the study that occurs, the philoptikos. Last time I was here in September, it was a time for the festival. So in other words, when Father asks you, or you see an opportunity, it's not doing something just to help the priest out. No, it's for us. It's really an opportunity for us to deepen and to make more personal our faith. Because if we don't become active in our faith, it's very difficult to have a personal and deeply personal faith that is our own. And then maybe the final way, there's many ways, but another way is to read about the lives of the saints. And we have, especially with some of the new saints, St. Paisios, St. Porphyrios, modern-day saints that within the last 20, 30 years have lived. People we know have known them and their spiritual fathers. So we have lives of saints that we can read to encourage us and to inspire us. So maybe, so I see some of you touching your lips. So that must mean it must be time for me to wrap up. So I do understand touch. Okay. So please understand. What I am saying is that until we have this personal encounter with the Lord, in other words, until we've been touched, perhaps our faith is not as strong or as personal as it could be. And maybe, just maybe, that's what the Lord is challenging with us today. So take heart. Remember, take heart if you feel you've sincerely been trying to grow closer to the Lord and doing all the things and even following the direction of your spiritual guide. So remember, take heart if that's you, because maybe we're so concerned with this, having this particular faith that we may not just be listening or experiencing the Lord. Because remember what the Lord said in the book of Psalms. He said, "Be still and know that I'm God." So yes, we need an active faith, but we also need to just be still and allow God to be God in our lives if we want to experience this deep, personal relationship with the Lord, such that we know that the Lord is active and present in our lives.